the moment Catherine Doyle stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, as though the dust itself had paused mid-swirl to take notice of her. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that the wind immediately set about unpinning, green eyes sharp enough to catch every detail of the weathered wooden storefronts and the sun-bleached faces that lined the main street. She carried a single leather trunk, a carpet bag, and a letter folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. The letter was from a man named Harold Doyle, her uncle, who had written to tell her she had inherited his general store following his passing, and that she had better come collect it before the county sold it off for unpaid debts. Catherine had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the better part of 3 years working as a seamstress for a woman who paid poorly and complained constantly. She had no husband, no particular prospects, and a stubborn independence that her mother had always said would either save her or ruin her. She intended to let it save her. The stagecoach driver tossed her trunk down without ceremony, nearly clipping the boot of a man standing too close to the road. The man stepped back with the ease of someone accustomed to making way for things larger and louder than himself, and then he tilted the brim of his hat up slightly to look at her. He was tall, broad-shouldered without being exaggerated about it, with dark brown hair worn a little long beneath a well-used felt hat, and a jaw that carried 3 days of stubble as naturally as the earth carries grass. He wore a plain cotton shirt, suspenders, worn denim trousers, and boots that had walked real miles. He was not the most polished man Catherine had ever seen. He was, however, the most immediately present, the kind of man whose stillness in a moving world drew the eye without asking for it. He looked at her trunk, then at her, and said, "That nearly got my foot." "Your foot was in the road," she replied. A pause. Then the corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Fair point. You need help with that. I can manage." She tried to lift the trunk and found it heavier than she remembered because it had been the stagecoach driver who lifted it the last several times. She would not admit this. She gripped the handle and dragged it 2 full feet before the man appeared at her side without asking again and simply took the other handle. "I said I could manage," she told him. "And you could," he agreed. "Just slower." He looked straight ahead as they carried it together toward the boardwalk. "George Finley, I own the livery stable on the East End. Catherine Doyle, I own the general store, apparently." That got a real look from him. His eyes, she noticed, were a warm brown, the kind that did not make demands but did not miss anything either. "Harold Doyle's niece. Did you know him?" Everybody knew Harold. Good man. Terrible card player. He set the trunk down at the edge of the boardwalk and straightened. "Sorry for your loss." "I barely knew him," she said honestly. "We wrote letters. He seemed kind." She looked down the street toward the sign that read Doyles General Store, the paint peeling at the edges of the lettering. "I suppose I should introduce myself to whatever's left of the place." "I'll walk you," George Finley said, as simply as if he were offering to pass the salt. Catherine looked at him sideways. "You just met me." "Redemption Creek isn't very big," he said, picking up his end of the trunk again. "And your store's a neighbor of mine." "Makes sense I'd want to know what kind of neighbor I'm getting." She supposed that was reasonable enough. She took her end, and together they walked down the main street of Redemption Creek in the spring sunlight of 1878, neither of them saying much, both of them aware, in that particular animal way that certain people are aware of certain other people, that something had just shifted in the ordinary fabric of the day. The general store was a disaster. That was Catherine's assessment after her first full hour inside the place. The inventory was in no particular order. The ledger books were a chaos of Harold Doyle's cramped and enthusiastic handwriting. Several crates of dry goods had not been properly sealed and had suffered for it. And there was a family of mice living behind the flour barrels that had clearly been there long enough to consider the premises their own. George had set down her trunk and said he would let her get settled, but then he had noticed the warped board near the front door and mentioned it was a tripping hazard, And then he had happened to see that the window latch on the east side was broken. And somehow 40 minutes later he was still there, examining things that needed fixing with the focused expression of a man who genuinely could not leave a problem alone. "You don't have to do all this," Catherine said, coming around the counter with a broom she had found leaning against the back wall. "I know," he said. He was testing the hinge on one of the supply cabinet doors. "You've got a loose hinge here. You'll need to get someone in to fix it before it pulls the whole door off the frame." "Can you fix it?" "I can fix it." She looked at him for a moment. "Why?" He seemed to genuinely consider this. "Because it needs fixing," he said, as though this were a complete and sufficient answer, and perhaps for George Finley it was. Over the following days, Catherine threw herself into the work of salvaging the store. She spent the first morning sorting inventory, the second morning cleaning from floor to ceiling, and the third morning going through the ledgers with the grim focus of a woman who had always been good with numbers and who now needed that skill very badly. The store had debts. Not ruinous ones, but real ones, and they would need to be addressed before she could think about growing the business. She went to see the town banker, a florid man named Mr. Caswell, who seemed perpetually surprised to find himself in Texas, and who looked at her across his wide desk with the particular expression of a man accustomed to deciding what women could and could not do. "I understand your situation, Miss Doyle," he said carefully, "but a woman running a business alone is exactly what is going to happen," she said, "so perhaps we might focus on the financial particulars." He blinked, looked at his papers, and they got down to business. George came by the store that evening to fix the hinge he had promised to fix, bringing his tools in a worn leather bag. Catherine was behind the counter, writing in a fresh ledger book she had purchased, and she glanced up when he came in. "Mr. Caswell gave me 30 days to pay the first installment of what's owed," she said without preamble, because she was the kind of person who processed things by speaking them. "Which is reasonable, but it means I need customers immediately." George set down his bag and crouched by the cabinet. "Harold lost a few regulars in the last year when he got sick and couldn't keep the shelves stocked proper, but they're still in town. They'll come back if they know the store's open and running." "How do I get them to know that?" "Tell one person." He looked over his shoulder at her with that almost smile. "In Redemption Creek that does the job," she laughed, and it surprised her the ease of it. She had not laughed easily in a while. "Who should I tell?" "Mrs. Aldridge at the boarding house. She is constitutionally incapable of keeping information to herself, and she knows everyone." Catherine tucked that away. She watched him work for a moment, the competent certainty of his hands, the way he moved without wasted motion. "You're good at that," she said. "I'm good at a lot of things," he said, not boastfully, just factually, and somehow it made her smile again. She did tell Mrs. Aldridge, a wide woman with a bright scarf always wrapped around her graying hair, who had a laugh like a church bell and who looked at Catherine with immediate approval. By the following morning, 3 women had come in to see about purchasing fabric. A rancher had stopped by for rope and salt, and the young deputy who patrolled the main street had put in an order for ammunition. The store began to breathe again. George came back not to fix anything the next time but simply to buy a paper of pins and a length of twine, things he could have gotten anywhere, and he lingered at the counter longer than the transaction required, asking her how the ledgers were looking, whether she had met the Parsons family yet who lived 2 miles out and always came in on Saturdays, whether she had eaten anything today. And at that last question Catherine looked up from what she was doing with an expression that made him hold up one hand. "There's a pie counter at the saloon," he said. "I know that sounds peculiar. Mrs. Yates bakes and sells on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It's genuinely good pie." "You're inviting me to the saloon for pie." "I'm telling you that the saloon has pie. What you do with that information is your own affair." She fought a smile. "I'll consider it." He bought his pins and twine and walked out, and Catherine stood at the counter for a full 30 seconds afterward doing nothing, which was unusual for her. On Thursday she went to the saloon at noon. George was already there at a corner table, which she noticed but did not comment on, because she could not be sure whether he had planned it or whether it was coincidence, and she was not ready to ask which it was. The pie was apple, thick and sweet and real, and she ate every bite while George drank coffee and they talked about nothing important and everything interesting. He told her he had come to Redemption Creek 6 years ago from Tennessee, that he had worked on a cattle drive first and then a ranch, and then had saved enough to buy the livery stable from an old man named Cooper who wanted to go live near his daughter. He said he liked the work because he liked horses, which he said with the straightforward affection of a man who meant exactly what he said. She told him about St. Louis, about the seamstress work, about learning to keep accounts because the woman she worked for had no aptitude for numbers and had been grateful for help, about her mother who was still in Missouri and who had written her a letter full of barely veiled panic when Catherine had said she was going to Texas. "Does she think you'll be scalped?" he asked. "She thinks I'll be unmarried and alone," Catherine said dryly, "which in her view is the greater danger." A pause. George looked at his coffee cup. "And what do you think?" "I think I'd rather be alone and useful than married and decorative." She looked at him evenly. "Present company is not intended as any kind of commentary." "I didn't take it as one." He looked up. The warmth in his eyes was very steady. "I think you're right for what it's worth. A person ought to build something real." "Is that what you're doing, building something real?" "Trying to." He turned his coffee cup once in his hands. "The livery does well enough. I've got a good string of horses. I'd like to expand eventually, maybe take on a partner, run some breeding stock." He said it simply as a fact about himself, not as a performance. "What about you?" "Beyond getting the store solvent," Catherine thought about it honestly, "I want it to be the kind of place people need, not just goods, information maybe. A place where people can leave messages, get news, know what's happening in the county, a real hub." He nodded slowly. "Harold always wanted that too. He just ran out of time." The word landed quietly between them. She looked at the last of her pie and then at the window where the main street of Redemption Creek moved in its ordinary afternoon way, horses and wagons and people with their particular errands and worries. "Then I'll do it for him too," she said, "since I've got the store now either way." She looked up and found George watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that made something in her chest do something unexpected. She looked away first, but it took effort. The weeks moved with the particular rhythm of a frontier town in spring, purposeful and unrepeating, each day a different arrangement of the same elements. Catherine learned her customers by name and preference within the first 2 weeks. She learned that Redemption Creek had approximately 400 residents, a Methodist church, a one-room schoolhouse, a doctor who also pulled teeth, a weekly newspaper called the Creek Courier run by a nearsighted man named Borden, and a complicated social ecosystem she was gradually mapping. She also learned that George Finley was well regarded in town in the specific way that comes not from prominence or position, but from consistency. People trusted him because he did what he said what he meant, and did not involve himself in other people's business unless asked. He was not the kind of man who needed to be the loudest in the room. He was the kind of man the room reorganized itself around without quite noticing. She noticed. She noticed the way he handled a nervous horse with hands that were all patience and no hurry. She noticed that he was quietly kind to the 2 Comanche boys who sometimes came through town with a small trading party, treating them with the same straightforward courtesy he gave everyone, in a town where that was not always the case. She noticed that he remembered things people told him, small things, and that when he asked after them later people were surprised and pleased by it. She noticed these things and told herself she was simply observing her neighbor, her town, learning the place she had come to live, which was true and also only part of the truth. It was in the 4th week that the trouble arrived, in the form of a man named Aldous Crane. Crane was a land agent, the kind who operated on the legal edge of things and filed the correct papers and wore the correct suit, and was nevertheless, in every meaningful sense, a predator. He arrived at Doyle's general store on a Wednesday morning with two men at his back who were not introduced but whose function was clear enough, and he set a sheaf of papers on Catherine's counter and smiled with all his teeth. "Miss Doyle," he said pleasantly, "I represent certain parties who have an interest in the commercial properties on this block. Your uncle was in correspondence with these parties before his passing. There was an understanding." "There was no signed agreement," Catherine said. She had gone through Harold's papers twice. She knew exactly what was and was not there. Crane's smile did not move. Understandings aren't always written. In law, they need to be. She pushed the papers back toward him without reading them. "I'm not selling, Mr. Crane, not to your clients or anyone else. You've got debts. I've got a payment plan with the bank. Thank you for your concern." She looked at him with the flat green certainty of a woman who had dealt with men who thought they could simply outlast her patience. "I think you know where the door is." He took his papers and went, but the smile he carried out with him was not a pleasant one, and his two men looked at the store as they left with the assessing eyes of people calculating dimensions. Catherine stood behind her counter for a full minute after they had gone, willing herself to stay calm. Then she went to the back room and stood there breathing for another minute because she was frightened, and she believed in acknowledging fear before she put it aside and moved. She told George that evening when he came by. She had not planned to, but he asked how her day had been, and she found it coming out in the telling, factual and sequenced. He listened with his full attention, the way he did everything, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "Crane's been around before," he said. "He made offers on 3 properties last year. The widow Harmon sold, the others didn't." "What happened to the ones who didn't?" "Nothing dramatic, some inconvenience." "Crane prefers pressure to violence mostly." He looked at her steadily. "But mostly isn't all. Do you think I should be worried?" He seemed to weigh his answer carefully. "I think you should be careful, and I think you shouldn't be alone here after dark until we know what he's planning." "We," she said. He met her eyes. "Neighbors," he said simply. And then, quieter, "and I'd rather know you're safe." She felt the warmth of that travel somewhere it had no business going. She held herself very still and said, "I can take care of myself, Mr. Finley." "I know you can," he said. "I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying I'd feel better knowing it." There was a difference in those two things, and she knew it, and the fact that he seemed to know it too did something to the distance she had been carefully maintaining between appreciation of a man and anything more complicated. "George," she said, for the first time, not Mr. Finley. He went very still. "Thank you," she said, "for the concern, and for the fixing of hinges and the information about the pie." "You're welcome," he said, "Catherine." It was the first time he had used her given name too, and they both felt it, and neither of them made anything of it in the moment, and that restraint made it more rather than less significant. Crane's inconvenience, as George had called it, arrived in the form of a supply problem. 3 different freight companies that served the store suddenly developed scheduling conflicts. 2 of Catherine's regular suppliers sent polite notes saying they were overbooked through the summer. It was coordinated enough to have a hand behind it, subtle enough to be unprovable. Catherine went to work on the problem the way she went to work on every problem, systematically and without panic. She wrote letters. She visited the general store in the next town, a woman named Rosario who ran a tight operation and who looked at Catherine across a loaded counter, and said with a directness Catherine appreciated, "You're the one Crane's after." Apparently. Rosario, who was 35, Mexican-born, and had been navigating the various hostilities of the Texas business landscape for 15 years, gave her the names of 3 suppliers who were independent of Crane's influence and who would be glad of the business. "He tried to squeeze me 2 years ago," she said. "I went around him. You can do the same." Catherine came back to Redemption Creek with a list of contacts and a renewed sense of direction, and also a respect for Rosario that she intended to act on in the form of reciprocal business. She found George waiting at the store when she returned, sitting on the boardwalk steps with his hat in his hands, looking at the street with the patient look of a man who is comfortable with his own company. He stood when he saw her. "How'd it go?" he asked. She told him. He listened. When she finished, he said, "Rosario is solid. Her husband used to bring horses to me before he passed. Good people." She said Crane tried to squeeze her too. He tries everyone eventually. George held the door for her as she went inside with her saddlebags, and then he followed without being asked. "He's got a buyer somewhere who wants this whole block, I think, not just your store." "Who else does he want?" "My livery, I suspect. And the feed store on the corner." He leaned against the counter with his arms crossed, thinking. "We'd be stronger if we talked to Ed Prout, who runs the feed store. If the three of us aren't selling, Crane doesn't have a block to sell." "You've thought about this," she said, looking at him. "I've had time." He met her gaze. "I didn't want to say anything until you'd had a chance to figure your own situation out first. Didn't seem right to come in with a plan before you'd had the chance to form one." She stared at him. It was such a specific and thoughtful thing to have done, the restraint of it, the respect of it, that she felt it like a physical sensation in the middle of her chest. "That is," she said carefully, "a remarkably considerate thing to have done." "I try," he said, and this time the corner of his mouth went all the way to a full smile, and it transformed his face, opened it up, made him look younger and more joyful, and Catherine Doyle, who prided herself on her equanimity, had to look at the ledger on the counter and pretend to be reviewing figures. They went to see Ed Prout together the next morning. Ed was a lean, leathery man of 50 who chewed tobacco and spoke in short sentences, and had a deep and abiding dislike of Aldous Crane that predated anything having to do with business, rooted in some prior history he declined to detail. He agreed to hold his property, shook both their hands with the grip of a man who considered a handshake binding as any contract, and said he'd be watching. The three properties formed a natural alliance. Crane's representative came back twice more and was turned away both times, and by the 6th week of Catherine's time in Redemption Creek, the pressure seemed to ease. Not entirely, but enough. On a warm Saturday evening in early June, the town held a social on the church grounds, which happened every few weeks and which Catherine attended, because Mrs. Aldridge had made her attendance a condition of continued access to the boarding house kitchen, where she sometimes used the larger stove for baking inventory for the store. There were lanterns strung between the trees, fiddle music courtesy of a man named Hap who played with more enthusiasm than precision, a long table of food, and about half the town in their better clothes. Catherine wore a green dress she had made herself, fitted at the waist, clean at the collar, and she arrived with Mrs. Aldridge, who promptly abandoned her to greet several women she was feuding with in the particular way that required standing extremely close and talking very warmly. George found her at the edge of the gathering, standing near the lanterns with a cup of lemonade, watching the dancing with the expression of someone who is interested but uncertain of their welcome within it. "Do you dance?" he asked. "I do," she said. "Do you?" "Badly," he said, "but with commitment." She laughed. He offered his hand. She took it. He danced with more commitment than precision, as promised, but he had a natural sense of rhythm that made up for the lack of formal training, and he kept her close enough that she felt certain and far enough that she felt respected, which was exactly the right proportion. She was a good dancer, had been since she was a girl, and she found that she could simply enjoy it without thinking too hard, which was unusual for her. When the song ended, they were slightly breathless and standing closer than the dance strictly required, and neither of them stepped back immediately. The lantern light caught the angles of his face and the warmth of his eyes, and Catherine thought with the part of her brain that was still observing, "This is a man I could trust. This is a man whose steadiness is real and not performed. This is a man who makes me want to stay still, which is remarkable because I have spent 3 years wanting to be elsewhere." "Thank you," she said, stepping back now. "Thank you," he said. He looked at her with that steady regard. "You're a good dancer." "You're committed," she told him, and his smile came back in full, and she made herself look away before she did something inadvisable. They danced twice more that evening, with appropriate intervals between. They talked with Ed Prout and his wife, and with the doctor, a thoughtful man named Dr. Hazen, and with Borden, the newspaper editor who wanted to write a piece about the new proprietor of Doyle's General Store, and whom Catherine agreed to speak to on Monday. She was aware of George's presence throughout the evening the way she was aware of a fireplace in a cold room, not staring at it but oriented toward it, knowing where the warmth was. When she walked home with Mrs. Aldridge through the warm summer evening, the older woman said nothing for 3 full blocks, which was such a departure from her usual behavior that Catherine glanced at her. "What?" Catherine said. "Nothing at all," Mrs. Aldridge said, in the tone of a woman who meant the precise opposite. Borden's article in the Creek Courier ran that Thursday under the heading New Proprietor brings fresh energy to Doyle's General Store, and was generally positive and mildly garbled in its details, which Catherine accepted as the price of publicity. Foot traffic in the store increased noticeably that week. She wrote to her mother in Missouri and told her the store was doing well and the town was decent, and she was safe and busy. She did not mention George Finley. She was not ready to mention George Finley because mentioning someone to her mother constituted a kind of commitment she had not yet made to herself. What she knew about herself, she was careful with her feelings. She had been badly let down once, at 21, by a man in St. Louis who had seemed solid and been nothing of the kind, who had made promises with the ease of someone to whom promises cost nothing. She had rebuilt her self-possession after that with deliberate care, the way you shore up a damaged wall, and she was not inclined to let anyone pull at it carelessly. George did not pull at anything carelessly. That was the specific problem. He was careful too, deliberate in his own way, and she could see it, and it made her trust him more than she wanted to, which was frightening in a way she was still finding language for. July came with full force, the Texas heat thick and relentless, and the store required a different inventory in summer than spring, and Catherine was deep in the logistics of this when Crane made his next move. It was not subtle this time. A man she had never seen before came into the store at mid-morning on a Tuesday, looked around very deliberately for someone else's benefit, purchased a stick of penny candy, and on his way out said without turning, "Smart women know when to take a good offer." She said nothing. He left. She went to the window and watched him cross the street toward the hotel, and she felt the fear again, the specific fear of someone who is being watched by people with resources, and then she put it aside with the same method as before. Acknowledge, set aside, move. She was closing the store that evening when the lock on the back door was found to have been tampered with, the mechanism scratched and bent in a way that was designed to make her notice it was done deliberately. It was a message, not an entry. She locked the front door, went through the connecting alley to George's livery stable, and knocked on the side door. He opened it within seconds, and whatever he saw in her face made him step back and let her in without asking the first question, which was the right thing to do because she needed 30 seconds to breathe before she could speak. She told him about the man, the candy, the door. He listened with his hands loose at his sides and an expression that was contained and careful, and underneath which she could see clearly that he was angry, not the noisy kind of angry but the steady kind, the kind that meant he was going to do something. "I want to go to Sheriff Lund," she said. "Tonight." Agreed. He took his hat from the peg. "I'll come with you." I'm a witness to the pattern of harassment," he said practically. "Ed Prout should come too." This was correct, and she knew it. They collected Ed, who needed no persuading, and the 3 of them went to the sheriff's office, where a man named Lund, a broad, slow-speaking former army man with calm gray eyes, listened to everything with methodical attention and then said he would pay a call on Crane in the morning. "That won't stop him," Catherine said. "No," Lund agreed. "But it starts a record. Every step of this process needs a record." He looked at her steadily. "You're doing the right things, Miss Doyle. Keep doing them. And let me know immediately if anything escalates beyond intimidation." It was good advice and cold comfort, and she walked back from the sheriff's office with George and Ed in the blue summer night, and Ed said good night at the corner and left them alone on the street. She and George stood in front of the store for a moment. "You're frightened," he said, not as a judgment, just as an observation. "Yes," she said. She was past pretending otherwise, at least with him. "That's reasonable." He was quiet a moment. "I'm going to sleep in my stable tonight instead of going home. I do that sometimes when I've got a horse I'm watching, but my stable shares a wall with your back room." She looked at him. He looked back at her, completely direct, and she understood that he was telling her he would be close by, that he was choosing to be, and that he was framing it as something practical because he was a man who understood her need to feel capable and not watched over in a patronizing way. "I appreciate that," she said quietly. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow you've got a store to open." She went upstairs to the small apartment above the store that had been Harold's and was now hers, and she lay in the dark and felt the fear, and then underneath the fear something warmer, the knowledge that on the other side of the wall below was a man who had chosen to stay near, and that the choosing of it had been done so well, so cleanly, that she could not find a reason to be anything but grateful. She slept better than she expected. Lund went to see Crane in the morning, as promised. Crane, as expected, was polite and puzzled and entirely innocent of any knowledge of any such events. His men had the same story. The man with the penny candy was not at the hotel anymore. But the visit stopped. Whether it was Lund's call or the knowledge that the three properties were united, or some calculation on Crane's part about the costs and benefits of continuing, the direct pressure ceased. He did not vanish from the county. He was seen twice in the following weeks, once in a meeting with a rancher on the north side of town, once in the hotel dining room with two men in suits who had arrived on the stage from Austin. He was working some other angle. For now, at least, Doyle's general store was left in peace. Catherine exhaled. She reorganized her shelves, contacted Rosario's suppliers, and by mid-July the store's ledger was trending in the right direction for the first time since she had arrived. She bought a small jar of good coffee to celebrate, which she ground herself on the machine Harold had left behind, and she brought a cup to George at the livery stable one morning without announcing she was doing it because it simply seemed right. He was shoeing a chestnut mare and looked up when she appeared in the doorway with two cups, and something in his expression, some brief unguarded thing, passed through his face before he got hold of it. He stood up and took the cup and said thank you. They sat on the fence rail outside and drank the coffee in the early morning while Redemption Creek woke up around them, and they talked about nothing pressing, about the mare, who was named Bess and had opinions, about the stage line that was adding a new route, about whether there would be a wet summer or a dry one. "Can I ask you something?" George said, and his voice had a different quality, quieter. "You can," she said. "What do you want this to be?" He was looking at the street. "I mean, what do you want your life here to look like? Not the store, beyond the store." She considered the question seriously. "I want roots," she said. "I want to know people by the way their lives change over time. I want to see children grow up and come into my store as adults." She paused. "I've never had that. I moved too much. I want to stop moving." "This is a good place to stop," he said. "I think so." She looked at him. "What about you? Is this where you stopped?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the cup in his hands. Then he looked at her with an honesty that she could feel. "I think I stopped moving when I found something worth staying for," he said. "The livery was part of it, but it wasn't all of it." He held her gaze. "I think the rest of it might have just arrived on the stage 4 months ago." Silence after that was very full. Catherine felt her heart do something large and somewhat alarming. She felt the familiar instinct to redirect, to deflect, to make a practical comment that would smooth the moment back into safe territory. She recognized the instinct, and this time, deliberately, she did not follow it. "George," she said. "Yes." "I am going to need you to be patient with me," she said. "I am not. I don't rush into things. I've been careful about this, and I intend to stay careful." She met his eyes. "But I am not indifferent. I want you to know that. I am the opposite of indifferent." He let out a breath slowly, the breath of someone who has been holding something carefully and can now set it down. "I've got patience," he said. "I'm good with horses. You learn patience working with horses." "Is that a compliment or a comparison?" she said. "It's just an observation," he said, and his smile came again, full and real, and she let herself look at it this time, really look at it, and felt something in herself open like a window on a fine morning. August was golden and blazing, and between the heat and the business of the store, and the long evenings that sometimes ended with George on the porch steps, and Catherine in the chair she dragged out from the back room, talking until the stars came out, Catherine Doyle fell in love in the unhurried and complete way that she did everything, without drama, and without doubt once it had settled into certainty. She knew it on an afternoon when a customer brought a sick child into the store asking if she had anything for fever, and Catherine went through Harold's medicine supply and found the appropriate camphor preparation and talked the mother through its use. And when she looked up after they had gone, George was in the doorway, had come in the middle of it and simply watched, and the way he was looking at her made the knowledge arrive with the quiet finality of a thing that has always been true being finally said aloud. She did not say anything then. But that evening on the porch she reached over and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and they sat like that until the sky went dark and the stars were fully out over Texas, which in summer was a sky worth waiting for. "Catherine," he said. "I know," she said. He turned to look at her. Even in the dark she could read his face. "Do you?" "I've known for a while," she said honestly. "I just needed to be certain." "And you're certain?" "I'm certain," she said. "I don't say things I'm not certain of. You know that about me by now." "I do," he said. He raised her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, warm and sure, and she felt it from that point through her whole body like heat from a good stove. Then he looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, "Then I'd like to court you properly, if you're willing." "I am willing," she said. "I am quite willing." He smiled then in the dark, and she could hear it in his voice when he said, "Good. I was planning on asking for at least another month." She laughed and he laughed, and it was the particular laughter of two people who are happy and know it and are not afraid to know it. And above them the summer stars of Texas blazed on with their ancient indifferent beauty, indifferent to everything except the fact of their own burning. The courtship of Catherine Doyle and George Finley was conducted with the same quality they brought to everything, honestly, with good humor, and with a great deal of actual conversation. They were not young people giddy with novelty. They were people in their mid-20s who had both had enough experience to know what they wanted, and enough sense to appreciate it when they found it. He brought her wildflowers from the field past the livery, presented without ceremony and often with grease on his hands. She made him proper meals in the apartment kitchen on Sunday evenings, which expanded into something of an institution, and he would bring bread from the bakery because the baker was his cousin's friend from the cattle drive years and gave him a good price. They rode out together on Saturday mornings, he on his gray horse Sable, and she on a steady bay mare named Temperance that he had selected from his string for her, because Temperance had excellent manners and Catherine had told him honestly she was a competent rather than expert rider. They rode out past the town limits into the wide Texas landscape, the hills and the scrub and the enormous sky, and she felt herself expanding into it, the space of this place, the scale of it that she had not been prepared for when she arrived, and that she now found herself needing the way she needed air. On one of these rides in September, they stopped at a high point of land that looked out over the valley where Redemption Creek sat in its bend of river, the church steeple and the grid of streets and the distant smoke from cook fires, small and particular and real in all that vastness. "I love this place," she said, with some surprise at how completely she meant it. "I know," he said. He was looking at her, not the view. She looked at him looking at her. "You're not looking at the view." "I have a better view," he said simply, without performance, and it was such a genuine thing to say that she reached over from Temperance's back and put her hand on his arm, and he covered it with his own. Autumn came in with color and cooler air, and the store's harvest inventory was a genuine success, Catherine having figured out by this point exactly what Redemption Creek needed and when it needed it. The debt was paid ahead of schedule. She wrote to her mother with the numbers, and her mother wrote back saying she was relieved, And also, when was Catherine getting married? And Catherine folded the letter with an expression that was fond and exasperated in equal parts. She and George had not spoken of marriage directly. They had spoken of the future in the way of two people who assume, without articulating, that their futures are connected, which is sometimes more telling than any formal discussion. He had said once, in passing, that he had been thinking about the property adjacent to his stable, whether he might be able to expand. She had said once, in passing, that the apartment above the store was really quite small for more than one person. And then they had both been quiet for a moment, with a kind of mutual awareness that felt like a door they were approaching but had not yet opened. It was Ed Prute's wife who said it plainly, as older women sometimes do, cornering Catherine at the church social in October with the cheerful directness of a woman who has been married 30 years and has strong opinions about its benefits. "That man is going to ask you," she said, nodding toward where George was helping set up tables. "And you're going to say yes because you're a sensible woman and he's a good man." "Mrs. Prute," Catherine said. "I'm just saying what everyone in town is thinking," Mrs. Prute said comfortably. "It's nice to see two sensible people." Catherine looked across the churchyard at George, who happened to look up at that moment and catch her eye, and that particular exchange of glances, small and private in the middle of a public gathering, was worth more than any speech. He asked her in November, on a cold, clear evening on the porch steps, which by this point had become their place, the specific place that was theirs in the way that two people accumulate a geography of shared moments. He had clearly prepared what he wanted to say and then, characteristic of him, abandoned the prepared version in favor of something more direct. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "Not just alongside you, with you. I want us to share things, the store and the livery and this town and whatever comes from all of it. I want to wake up knowing where you are and go to sleep the same way." He held her gaze with complete steadiness. "Catherine Doyle, will you marry me?" She did not make him wait. "Yes," she said. "George Finley, yes," he exhaled. He took both her hands. He said, "Thank you," as if it were a gift she had given him, which it was, and which he knew it to be, and the knowing of it made her love him more sharply than she had loved anything in recent memory. He kissed her then, properly and well, the kind of kiss that is not frantic or tentative but settled, the kiss of someone who knows what he's doing and intends to do it thoroughly, and she kissed him back with the same quality, and the cold November air of Redemption Creek, Texas, was not cold at all. They were married in December, in the Methodist church that Catherine had been attending since her third week in town, in a ceremony conducted by the pastor who had a good voice and sensibly short sermons, and who married them with warm efficiency and genuine feeling. Mrs. Aldridge wept with great enthusiasm. Ed Prute and his wife stood as witnesses. Rosario came up from the neighboring town with her children and flowers from her garden, preserved in oil in a clever way she had learned from her mother. Borden from the newspaper was there, and would later write an account that was more accurate than his usual work, because Catherine had proofread his draft in advance, which she would do for all subsequent pieces about herself. George stood at the front of the church in his good suit, which fit him well and which he had clearly pressed for the occasion, and when Catherine walked down the aisle in the dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with a fitted bodice and small covered buttons, he looked at her with an expression so open and certain that she felt it like sunlight, warm and without shadow. "You look beautiful," he said quietly, when she reached him before the ceremony had properly begun, just for her. "You look very well yourself," she said, just for him. The pastor cleared his throat. They turned forward. They said their words to each other and to the room and to whatever was larger than the room, and they meant every syllable, and when it was done they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife into the cool December morning with the bells of Redemption Creek ringing behind them. The winter that followed was the first winter Catherine had spent feeling genuinely at home somewhere in 6 years, and she found that the experience of home was less about stillness than she had imagined and more about having someone to be moving with. She and George were both busy people, both with work that mattered to them, both with the particular energy of people who find purpose in building things, and they moved through their days with a sense of alignment that she had not expected to feel so physical, so present in the body. The apartment above the store was small, as she had noted, and George moved his essential things from the room he had been renting, and they made the apartment work because they were practical people. But in February, he came to her with a sketch on a piece of paper, rough but readable, a house plan. "There's a lot on the south edge of town," he said, "between the store and the livery, roughly, near enough to both that it makes sense." He put the paper on the counter. "I've been thinking about this." She looked at the sketch. It was a good layout, 2 stories, a real kitchen, a porch facing south to catch the afternoon light. She looked up at him. "You drew this yourself?" "I'm not an architect," he said. "No, it's good, it's really good." She studied it. "The kitchen is larger than usual." "You cook real food," he said. "You should have the space for it." She felt a particular variety of love for him in that moment, the kind that is made of specifics, of being known in small ways. She put her hand on the sketch. "Let's do it," she said. The house went up through spring and early summer, George doing much of the work himself with the help of 2 men from town who he paid fairly, and Catherine contributing her own very real organizational skills to the process of material acquisition and scheduling, which she was very good at. She sourced the wood from a mill she had contacted through her supplier network, got a better price than the local lumber yard would have given them, and George accepted this with the uncomplicated pleasure of a man who appreciated competence in his partner and did not need it to be his own. It was during the building of the house, on a warm April afternoon, that Catherine realized something she had been suspecting for 3 weeks. She sat down on a newly built porch step and put her hand flat on her abdomen and thought the thought clearly, and then sat with it for a long moment in the sunlight. She told George that evening. He had come in from a long day's work, dusty and tired, and had washed up and was eating the supper she had made, and she sat down across from him and waited until he looked up. "I think we're going to have a baby," she said. The stillness that came over him was absolute, the way still water is absolute. Then he put down his fork with a very careful movement and looked at her with an expression she had never seen before on his face, something unguarded and large and joyful and a little staggered by itself. "Catherine," he said. "In the autumn, I think," she said. "I haven't seen Dr. Hazen yet. I will." He pushed back from the table and came around to her, and she stood up, and he held her, properly held her, his arms around her and his face in her hair, and he didn't say anything for a long moment, and she felt the slight shake of his breathing against her. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am so far from all right," he said, "in the best possible way." She laughed into his shoulder. He held her tighter. Dr. Hazen confirmed it. October was the estimate. The summer became a thing of double purpose. The house and the child, both in progress, both requiring attention, and Catherine moved through it with the energy of someone who has organized her life well enough that even large changes fit within its structure. She was sick in the mornings for 6 weeks, which she found maddening, and she managed it with ginger tea and the pragmatic determination to simply get on with things anyway because the store did not close itself. George noticed and said nothing about it in terms of suggesting she slow down, because he had learned something true about her by this time, which was that what she needed when she was struggling was not to be told to rest, but to have help offered in ways she could choose to accept. He took over the morning inventory counts 3 times a week without being asked, arriving before the store opened and doing the work quietly, leaving the ledger out for her. She noticed. She never said anything about it directly, but one morning she left a cup of good coffee on the ledger before he arrived, and when he came in and found it, he drank it without comment, and she could see from the other side of the store that he was pleased. They moved into the house in September, 2 weeks before the baby came. It was not quite finished in all its details. A few interior doors still lacking their hardware, a shelf in the kitchen not yet mounted, but it was habitable and sound, and it smelled of new wood and the particular quality of a place being made into a home, and Catherine stood in the kitchen on the first morning and ground coffee in the morning light coming through the south-facing window, and felt something so complete she had no single word for it. George came down from upstairs in his socks and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her in the morning light and said, "Good morning, Mrs. Finley," with such specific warmth in his voice that she looked at him over her shoulder and said, "Good morning, Mr. Finley." And it was domestically ordinary and privately very significant, and both of those things at once. Their son was born on the 12th of October, 1879. He arrived with no particular complication, attended by Dr. Hazen and Mrs. Aldridge, who had appointed herself midwife's assistant without anyone asking, and who was, it turned out, genuinely useful in this role. George was in the house, not in the room, as was the convention of the time, and Catherine knew he was there, and the knowing of it mattered. When Dr. Hazen came out and told him he had a son, Catherine heard George's single very quiet word through the door, "Good." He was brought in shortly after, and he sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold this small person for the first time. He held him the way he held everything that mattered to him, carefully and without drama, with his full attention. "He's got your eyes," George said. "You cannot possibly tell that," Catherine said. "He's an hour old." "I can tell," he said with perfect conviction, and he looked up at her with those eyes that were in fact very possibly the same eyes, dark and warm and paying attention to everything, and she thought, yes. All right, she would give him that one. They named him James Harold Finley. James for George's father, who had died when George was 16 and whose absence was still a real thing in him. Harold for her uncle, who had given her this place, this life, this extraordinary and unexpected happiness. James Harold Finley came into Redemption Creek, Texas in the autumn of 1879 and began, almost immediately, to have opinions about things, which both his parents found highly entertaining and entirely expected. The store continued. The livery continued. The house became more fully itself over the months, the shelves going up, the hardware on the doors, a rocking chair on the south porch that George built in the evenings in winter by lamplight, measuring carefully and planing the wood by hand, bringing it in finished in February with the same straightforward presentation he brought to everything. "It's for the porch," he said. "I can see that," she said, running her hand along the smooth arm. "Did you make this yourself?" "Took me all winter," he said. "You probably shouldn't look at the joints too closely." She sat in it. It rocked perfectly. She looked up at him. "The joints are fine," she said. "George, it's beautiful." He ducked his head slightly in the way he did when something mattered to him, and he was not entirely sure how to wear the feeling. She reached up and took his hand and held it. Aldous Crane made one last appearance in the spring of 1880. He came into the store on a Monday morning, alone this time, and he was thinner than she remembered, and the specific brightness of his eyes that had been so unpleasant to read was somewhat dimmed. He bought a tin of tobacco and said, not looking at her directly, that he had heard she'd done well with the store. "I have," Catherine said. "Harold would have been pleased," Crane said, which surprised her, and then he said nothing else and took his tobacco and left, and she watched him go with a complicated feeling that was not quite pity and not quite forgiveness, but somewhere in the vicinity of both, the feeling of seeing someone whose threat has passed and who is, after all, just a person. She mentioned it to George that evening. He thought about it and said, "I heard he lost his investor in Austin." The whole plan fell apart. A pause. "Some things resolve themselves." "Not all things," she said. "Not all things," he agreed, "but enough of them." The summer of 1880 was a good summer. James Harold had learned to walk in March, and had since developed a full program of ambulation that kept his parents busy and delighted him enormously. He had his father's steadiness in miniature and his mother's observational sharpness, and together these qualities produced a child who missed nothing and fell down without appearing to notice it. George had expanded the livery by then, exactly as he had hoped, bringing in a breeding stallion from a rancher in New Mexico, and beginning the careful work of building a breeding line. Catherine had established the store as a genuine information hub, just as she had wanted, maintaining a notice board for messages and notices, keeping current newspapers from Austin and San Antonio, and establishing a quiet reputation as a person who knew things and could be trusted with them. Rosario came to visit in the summer with her 3 children and spent a week, and Catherine and Rosario sat on the south porch in the evenings after the children were in bed and talked about business and the specific character of frontier towns and the experience of being women who ran things in a time and place that sometimes preferred they did not. They had, in the year and a half since their first meeting, become genuine friends in the specific way of people who respect each other's competence above all else and find in that respect a foundation for warmth. "You're happy," Rosario said one evening, not as a question. "I am," Catherine said. She was quiet a moment. "It surprised me, the completeness of it. I expected more friction." "Because you'd had more friction." "Yes." She looked out at the dark yard where the pecan tree they had planted in spring was too small yet to have anything but promise. "I spent a long time being capable but not quite happy. I didn't know they could be the same thing." "They can't always be," Rosario said. "You found one of the rare situations." "I know," Catherine said. "I know I did." Inside the house she could hear George moving, the ordinary sounds of him before bed, water being poured, a door closing. She knew the sounds of him the way she knew the sounds of the house itself, foundational and familiar and entirely welcome. In the autumn of 1880, James Harold turned 1 year old and celebrated this achievement by eating a full piece of the cake Catherine made and wearing the remainder. And the resulting photograph, taken by a traveling photographer who came through Redemption Creek in October, showed a small boy with cake on his face and 2 parents laughing behind him, which was not a formal portrait, but was a true one. The photograph sat on the shelf in the kitchen for many years, and when people asked about it, Catherine would say it was the most accurate picture ever taken of the Finley family, and George would say he agreed. And whoever was asking would look at the 2 of them and understand without being told anything further that these were people who knew exactly where they were. By the spring of 1882, Redemption Creek had grown. The railroad was coming closer each year to the county, and the town had attracted new businesses and new families, and the Finley establishments, the store and the livery, were among the oldest and most trusted in a commercial landscape that now had more entries. Catherine had hired a young woman named Alice to help in the store 3 days a week, a practical young person of 19 who was quick with numbers, and whom Catherine was quietly teaching the business from the ground up in the manner of someone who understood that sharing knowledge made knowledge more powerful rather than less. George had taken on a stable hand, a young man of 20 named Tomas who had grown up on a ranch to the west, and who had a gift with horses that George recognized and respected without making a production of it, which was the most effective kind of mentoring. James Harold, at 2½, was engaged in the extremely important project of learning the names of all the horses in his father's stable, and had strong views about each of them, particularly best the chestnut mare, who was elderly by now, and who tolerated the child's attentions with saintly patience. Catherine was also, by spring, aware of the particular familiar signs that suggested James Harold would not be an only child for very much longer. She told George on a Wednesday evening in the kitchen while he was making coffee, which was his recent project, learning to make the coffee properly, a task he had approached with the focused seriousness he brought to acquiring any skill. He turned from the stove. She said it plainly, as she said most things. He set the coffee pot down with the same careful movement as before, and looked at her with the same expression as before, the large and unguarded thing, and she felt again the wave of warmth at the fact that it was the same, that it had not diminished, that a man who had already become a father could still be staggered by the prospect of becoming one again. "When?" he said. "November, I think." He came to her and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her with great care and said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "Good," he said. And he kissed her, warmly and at some length, and the coffee was slightly overboiled by the time they remembered it, and neither of them minded at all. Their second child was a boy as well, born in November 1882, named William Thomas Finley. Thomas for an uncle of George's from Tennessee who had written him kind letters when he was a young man alone on the trail. William arrived with considerably more urgency than James Harold had managed, Dr. Hazen arriving at a speed that suggested he had perhaps been warned to stay close, and Mrs. Aldridge once again taking up her self-appointed station with absolute confidence. William Thomas Finley was, from his first hours, a different character than his brother entirely. Where James was watchful and deliberate, William was immediate and emphatic, expressing his views on all subjects with great clarity and no patience for ambiguity. He had his mother's auburn hair and his father's eyes, which meant that George's prediction about the eyes from 2 years prior had proven exactly correct in the second instance, which he did not mention because he was not that kind of man but which he was quietly satisfied about. The house, already full of life, became fuller and noisier and more itself. Catherine had not known that she wanted children in this particular way, had known she might like them but not that she would feel for them this specific and overwhelming specificity, the particular love that is only for these people and no others. She told George this one night and he said he felt the same, that he had not known he could feel anything with this particular weight and find it not heavy but light, the way important true things sometimes were. "I didn't expect any of it," she said. She meant Redemption Creek and the store and him and the children and the house and the whole of the life she was living. "Neither did I," he said. He was lying beside her in the dark, the house quiet around them with the sleeping children's quiet, and he turned his head to look at her. "I'm glad the stagecoach nearly got my foot," she laughed in the dark. "I am too," she said. In 1883, Redemption Creek held its 10th anniversary celebration as an incorporated town, and the festivities were considerable by local standards. A parade of which Hap the Fiddler was a key component, a competition for the best pie in which Mrs. Aldridge came third, a ceremony at the town hall where various founders and long-standing residents were recognized. George was among those recognized, having been in Redemption Creek longer than most of the current commercial proprietors, and he stood at the front of the hall with the quiet good humor of a man who finds public acknowledgement mildly embarrassing, but accepts it with grace. Catherine was recognized as well, for what the mayor called the transformation of Doyle's general store into a genuine community institution, and she accepted this with the directness she brought to all things, saying into the gathered room that the credit belonged in part to her Uncle Harold who had built the foundation, and in part to the town itself which had met her generosity with generosity. And she looked at George while she said it, and he looked back, and it was very public and very private at the same time. James Harold, who was 3½, sat through the ceremony with remarkable composure, and then immediately upon its conclusion ate 4 cookies and ran 3 times around the hall. And William, who was not quite a year, slept through everything in the way of people who have correctly identified the most reasonable response to a formal occasion. The years continued in the way that good years do, not without difficulty or grief or the ordinary complications of a life lived fully, but with a foundational happiness that did not require constant maintenance because it was built on things that were real. There was a drought in 1884 that was hard on everyone in the county, and Catherine managed the store's resources carefully and extended credit more than was strictly prudent, and collected it less aggressively than she might have because the times required it. And George helped 3 neighboring ranches keep their horses fed through the dry months in arrangements that were more neighborly than commercial. And when the rains came in the fall, the town had lost some things but held together in its essential nature. There was a letter from Catherine's mother in Missouri in 1885 saying that her health was not what it had been, and Catherine wrote back and then, After a week of thinking, wrote again to say that if her mother wanted to come and live near them in Redemption Creek, there was room and welcome. Her mother arrived in March, a small, vigorous woman named Catherine Doyle, who immediately had opinions about the arrangement of the kitchen and became within 6 months as embedded in the social fabric of Redemption Creek as if she had always been there, an outcome that surprised everyone slightly, including Catherine herself. Catherine was 61 and not without the biases of a woman of her generation and geography, but she was also fundamentally decent and capable of updating her views when her experience required it. And Redemption Creek required some updating over time, and she managed it. She adored James, Harold, and William with a totality that was undiscriminating. She developed a complicated but genuine friendship with Mrs. Aldridge, which involved a great deal of disagreement and an apparent inability to stay away from each other. She told George privately in the kitchen one morning when Catherine was in the store that he was a good man and she was glad her daughter had found him, and George said thank you with the straight simplicity of someone who took the statement at full weight and did not deflect it. By 1886, James Harold was 6 years old and attending the schoolhouse with the intense engagement of a child who had been raised in a store where adults talked about real things and had developed specific views on arithmetic, freckled moths, and the correct way to harness a horse, the last being a subject he had researched thoroughly with his father. William was 3.5 and had strong opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express most of them, and George handled both of them with the steady patience of a man who had spent years with animals and understood that the key to young creatures was consistency and respect in roughly equal measure. On a winter evening in December 1886, Catherine and George sat on the south porch in their coats with cups of coffee, the children inside with Catherine who had said she would put them to bed, which was an offer Catherine had learned to accept without guilt. The town was quiet below them, lights in windows, a horse moving somewhere on the street, the distant sound of the saloon which was lively on Friday evenings. The pecan tree in the yard was real now, 5 years old and properly a tree, and it had given them nuts in the autumn that Catherine had made into a pie that George said was the best thing he had ever eaten, which might have been true or might have been the kind of thing a husband says with full sincerity because he means the entirety of his life when he says it. "What are you thinking?" George asked. He could ask her this and get a real answer. "I'm thinking about Harold," she said. "My uncle. Whether he'd like what we've done with the place." "I think he would," George said. "I think he'd especially like that it's a place that people actually rely on." "I think so too." She looked at the yard, the dark tree. "I'm also thinking that I'm very glad I came." He turned to look at her. Even in the winter dark she could see him clearly, had learned his face the way she knew the inside of the store and the way the house sounded in different weathers, foundationally. "I'm glad you came," he said. "Every day I'm glad. Even the day I nearly dropped my trunk on your foot. Especially that day," he said. "That was an excellent day." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat together in the December night with their coffee growing cold and neither of them minding, looking out over the town that was theirs, and the yard that was theirs, and the life that was theirs, built with real work and real feeling, between two people who had been willing to be careful, and then willing to be certain, and who had found in each other the specific and irreplaceable thing, not the idea of a person but a person, real and known and beloved. Inside the house, Catherine could be heard telling a story to the boys in her particular storytelling voice, louder than necessary and full of dramatic pauses, and James Harold's concentrated questions and William's interruptions formed a small chaos of family sound, and it came through the walls with the warmth of a good fire. George pressed his mouth to Catherine's temple, warm and brief and entirely certain. "We should go in," she said. We told her an hour. 2 more minutes, he said. She stayed. The stars were out over Texas, the same vast stars she had looked at on the night he had first held her hand, not going anywhere, not changing, burning with the same ancient and sufficient light. Redemption Creek sat in its bend of river below the hills, a real town with real people and real stories, and within it, a store with a good inventory and honest ledgers and a notice board covered in the messages of people who needed to reach each other, and a livery stable where the horses were well kept, and the man who ran it was trusted, and a house with a south-facing porch and a pecan tree and a rocking chair worn smooth with use, and 2 boys asleep now probably, despite all evidence to the contrary, and a grandmother whose voice was still going with the story, and on the porch 2 people who had found each other by the strange economy of inheritance and stagecoach schedules, and the fact that a man had been standing too close to the road on a spring morning in 1878. "Okay," George said, standing and offering her his hand. "We should go in." She took his hand and stood, and they went inside into the light and the warmth and the noise, into the life they had made, which was full and real and very, very good. They lived that way for a long time. The store passed through its seasons. The livery grew. James Harold grew up to have his father's patience and his mother's arithmetic, and went to study in Austin at 20, and came back at 25 with a law degree and a wife, and the clear intention to stay in Redemption Creek, which pleased both his parents enormously. William grew up with his own particular combination of his parents' qualities, and a talent for horses that surpassed even his father's, and took over the breeding program when George was ready to hand it over, which George did with pride and no sentimentality, because he was not sentimental, only genuinely moved. Catherine Doyle lived to 78, sharp and opinionated to the last, and her friendship with Mrs. Aldridge was one of the enduring legends of the town's social life, being as it was a relationship of perpetual disagreement and absolute loyalty that seemed to sustain both women considerably. And George and Catherine Finley grew old in Redemption Creek, in the house with the south porch and the pecan tree, in the particular way of people who have built something real together, and do not need it to be otherwise. They were, everyone in town agreed, the kind of couple that made a place feel more like itself, the kind whose steadiness was a fact in the landscape the way the church steeple was a fact or the river was a fact, simply there and real and part of what the place was. On the morning of their 30th wedding anniversary, George brought Catherine coffee in the rocking chair on the south porch in the early light, the way he had done 10,000 mornings, and sat in the chair beside her that he had added years ago as a companion to hers, and they drank it in the winter quiet while the pecan tree stood in the yard, large and established now, throwing shade in summer and holding snow in winter, a tree they had planted together and watched grow and never once thought to count the years of. 30 years, she said. 30 years, he agreed. She looked at him, at the gray in his hair and the lines in his face and the eyes that were exactly the same, warm and present and missing nothing. He looked back at her with the particular expression she had first seen on a stagecoach platform in 1878 and had never stopped being grateful for, the expression of a man who is paying full attention. "I would do all of it again," she said, "every single piece of it." "So would I," he said, "starting with standing in the road." She laughed. He smiled. The winter morning of Redemption Creek came on around them, bright and cold and real, and they were home, which was the truest and best thing they had ever built, and it was finished, and it was enough, and it was everything.